今天是2020年10月6号，可能会是载入史册的一天呢，因为今天是这个科学家 Talk 登陆 B 站的第一天啊！我以一个70后高龄的身份来到 B 站，非常惶恐啊，所以先给各位拜个码头啊！出来宝地，请多关照。今天要说的呢，就是昨天刚刚获得2020年诺贝尔生物学和医学奖的哈维·阿尔特。他获奖的原因啊，是第一个发现了饼干、花生、薯片、火腿肠、矿泉水，不是第一个发现了丙肝病毒，非常有先见之明的。上个月呢，我们科学家 Talk 通过 Zoom 视频连线的方式和他进行了长达1个小时的亲切、友好、愉快且卓有成效的对话。
Hello. Hey, morning.
Hi, Dr. Alter. All right, see you. Hi.
Hi. Thus, in 1970, we began an all-volunteer donor program, and we also introduced the first test for the hepatitis B virus, hepatitis B surface antigen. As you can see, that resulted in a dramatic 70% decrease in the incidence of post-transfusion hepatitis, bringing the levels down to about 10%, even though the patients were still getting large amounts of blood, as shown in the squares, 18.2 units on average. In 1973, more sensitive tests for hepatitis B were developed, and we went back and tested all these cases and found that only about a third were due to the hepatitis B virus, as shown in purple, and there was some other non-B entity, and we didn't know what that was. Then in 1975, Feinstein, Kapickian, and Purcell, using immune electron microscopy, discovered the hepatitis A virus. And we immediately went back and tested these non-B cases for hepatitis A virus, and not a single case was due to hepatitis A. So it was then, in a rather brilliant deductive reasoning, we said that if these cases were not A and were not B, we would call them non-A, non-B. And we used this very nondescript term because we hadn't yet proven there was a virus. And if so, we didn't know how many viruses there were.
你看哈，阿尔特教授啊，根本看不出来呀，已经85岁高龄了。其实呢，阿尔特啊，本应该在44年前就拿到这个诺贝尔奖的。1976年，巴里教授因为发现了乙肝病毒而获得了当年的诺奖。而在此之前呢，阿尔特和巴里一直是合作的搭档。1964年，他们分开了。阿尔特呢，因此错失了1976年的诺奖。当然呢，44年前的擦肩而过，是为了今天与诺奖更好的相遇。丙肝病毒啊，被称为沉默的杀手。据这个世卫组织估计啊，全球有7100万慢性的这个丙型肝炎的病毒感染者，每年近40万人死亡，其中大多数死于肝硬化和肝癌，而中国也有1000万感染者。因此呢，世卫组织提出来2030年全球消灭丙肝。阿尔特教授是如何看待这个目标的呢？
HCV is a world-wide problem. It's not just from transfusion. There are estimated to be 170 million people who are chronically infected with hepatitis C, about 5 million of those in the United States. And the reason there are so many chronic infections is that once you're infected with hepatitis C, we are incapable of clearing this virus in 75 to 85% of cases. People develop persistent infection. So the question is why so much persistent infection? Well, we know in data I'm not going to show you is that there is blunting of the immune response to the virus, both the innate immune response and the adaptive immune response. But one of the striking features was that this virus exists as a very complex quasi-species.
作为全球著名的病毒学家之一啊，关于这个当前肆虐全球的这个新冠病毒，阿尔特的观点呢比较悲观。他说呢，这个目前啊 没有什么这个特效药和这个有效的这个疫苗，我们只能戴口罩和保持社交距离来阻止病毒的扩散。
Well, we don't really have any good drugs right now.
Yeah.
I'm surprised at that because I would think the same kind of things that work for hepatitis C would work for COVID, that you would use specific enzyme inhibitors and they would work. But so far, the only drug, the remdesivir, that has been reprogrammed, it was made for Ebola, but it was reprogrammed to COVID. It has some benefit in very sick patients, perhaps reducing the time in intensive care, but it's not the magic bullet that we would want. So the magic bullet will be the vaccine, but it's still a large question whether the vaccine will give you the proper immunity, will it give you lasting immunity. And that's why it's so important to do the phase 3 clinical trials to really determine the efficacy and the safety of these vaccines. Meanwhile, we have a very good semi-vaccine, which is the face mask. The face mask is very powerful protector.
Oh, right. Face mask. Yeah, that's
Face
right.
mask. It's people are not using it in the U.S. efficiently. It's very effective, not very well used.
1935年，阿尔特出生在一个犹太的家庭他的父亲呢就有这个学医的这个梦想，最后呢因为家境贫寒，放弃了学医，成了一个成功的商人。类似的困境呢，同样出现在阿尔特的儿子的身上。
It's very, very difficult. Just to give you an example, my son was in medicine. He's a good researcher. And he would send in a grant. They were only funding 6% of grants proposals at that time. So he'd send in a grant, and he would get a good score, but not a fundable score. And then they would recommend these changes. Then he would make those changes, and then it would get reviewed by a different panel, and they would recommend different changes. And after a while, he just gave up. He just did not want to pursue that because it was so painful. And this is happening. I think we're losing a generation of young people who cannot obtain the funding to continue the research. So they're always tacking on to somebody else's research as a fellow, but then to go out on their own, it's very, very difficult. And more money for the young investigators would be really great.
当地时间早上4点45分，阿尔特被电话吵醒，他没有去接。5分钟之后呢，电话又响了，他还是没有去接。直到第3次，阿尔特才愤怒地接起了电话。对方告诉他得诺奖了。阿尔特说呢，这是他这辈子最好的闹铃。这个故事告诉我们一个道理凌晨4点响了3声的电话一定要接，因为你不接，他会响第4声的。拜拜。